Say it again, and this time say it like you mean it, because right now you sound like a man who is scared of a 17-year-old. Bruno Fletcher said it low, almost friendly, the kind of voice a man uses when he wants an audience to think he is being reasonable rather than cruel. He stood at the foot of the driveway with his arms crossed, a whistle still hanging from a lanyard around his neck, sweat darkening the collar of his polo shirt from an afternoon of drills. Behind him, 17-year-old Blake Kingsley shifted his weight from foot to foot, knuckles wrapped in athletic tape, jaw set the exact same way it was set in 100 tournament photographs lining the hallway of his parents' house. Amos Fraser did not answer right away. He had 2 grocery bags in his hands, one in each arm, and he set them down slowly on the concrete without looking away from Fletcher. 41 years old, close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, forearms corded from something that had nothing to do with a gym membership. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and basketball shorts, the uniform of a man doing nothing more dangerous that evening than buying milk and bread for his daughter. "I heard you the first time," Amos said. "My answer is still no." Fletcher smiled like that was the funniest thing he had heard all week. Somewhere down the block, a patrol car idled at the curb, its radio crackling low enough that only the closest houses could hear it. A dispatcher's voice moved through the static, flat and procedural. "Unit 14, be advised. Report of a verbal disturbance. Fernwood Court. No weapons indicated. Complainant requesting contact only. No code 3. Deputy Carl Oswald sat behind the wheel with his window cracked, in no hurry to get out of the car. Amos picked the bags back up. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Blake again. He walked past both of them toward his front door, and the only sound behind him was Fletcher's low laugh and the click of a phone screen lighting up in Otis Blaine's hand across the street. 11 seconds of video already saved to a folder that would later matter far more than anyone standing in that driveway understood. If a story about quiet strength getting tested is exactly what you needed today, hit that like button before we keep going, because it only gets harder from here. To understand how a grown man ended up standing in his own driveway being dared into a fight by a teenager, you have to go back 14 months, to the day Amos Fraser and his daughter Willow first drove through the stone gate of Fernwood Reach with a moving truck behind them, and exactly one box left unlabeled on purpose, the one with her mother's reading glasses and a folded flag still inside its case. Fernwood Reach sat 40 minutes from Naval Station Norfolk in Isle of Wight County, Virginia, the kind of gated community built for people who wanted a golf cart path and a homeowners association newsletter more than they wanted neighbors who asked hard questions. The houses were brick and vinyl, the lawns cut on a schedule, the mailboxes uniform down to the paint code. Amos had chosen it for one reason that had nothing to do with the golf cart path. It was quiet, it was safe, and the elementary school 2 miles down the road had a science program that Willow, 10 years old and already talking about marine biology, would not stop asking about on the drive down from their last posting. He was a widower. His wife Priscilla had died 2 years earlier, an illness that took 8 months to finish what it started, and in the time since, Amos had built his whole life around one unbending principle. Willow would have stability, even if he had to manufacture it out of nothing. 6 a.m. runs before she woke up. Breakfast at the same table every morning. A bedtime that did not move for holidays, deployments, or bad days. He was a senior chief in the United States Navy, stationed out of Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek, and when neighbors asked what he did, he told them the truth as far as the truth was allowed to go. He said he was in the Navy. He did not say more, because there was no more he was permitted to say, and he had long since stopped noticing how strange that silence sounded to people who filled every silence of their own with detail about kitchen renovations and vacation homes. Doris Alder noticed it before anyone else did. 71 years old, a retired court reporter who had spent 30 years transcribing testimony in the Isle of Wight County Courthouse before she retired to a small brick house 2 doors down from the Frasers. Doris had a habit she had never been able to shake, and had never wanted to. She wrote things down. Weather, deliveries, the time the mail truck came, the day the Kingsley family's landscaping crew showed up with a different truck than usual. It was not suspicion. It was 30 years of training that told her small facts, dated and specific, were the only kind of facts that mattered when someone eventually needed them, and she had watched enough courtrooms fall apart over a missing date to trust her own habit more than her own memory. "You military?" she asked him once. over the low hedge between their yards, watching him coil a garden hose with the same crossed over, crossed under motion every single time, the same number of loops, the same final tuck. Navy, he said, and smiled, and did not say anything else. She did not push. She just wrote the date in a spiral notebook she kept in a kitchen drawer, and underneath it, 3 words: asked, no answer. She had learned a long time ago that the people worth writing down were rarely the ones who talked the most. The community pool became one of their regular stops that first summer, and it was there, on only their 3rd visit, that Willow noticed something she did not fully understand yet. Her father never sat with his back to the gate. He chose the same bench every time, the one closest to both exits, and while other parents scrolled through their phones under umbrellas, his eyes moved in slow, unhurried sweeps across the water, the fence line, the parking lot beyond it, and back again, a rhythm so smooth that nobody watching would have called it anything other than a man enjoying the sunshine. "What happened to your arm?" she asked him once, tracing a finger along a pale, uneven line just above his left shoulder while he toweled off her hair after a swim. "Old scrape," he said. "From work." "What kind of work leaves a scrape like that?" she asked, because she was 10 and had already learned that adults answered easier questions than the ones underneath them. He looked at her for a moment, weighing, the way he weighed most things before he said them out loud. "The kind I cannot really talk about, baby," he said finally. "Not because it is bad, just because that is the rule." She accepted that the way she accepted most of his careful, half-finished answers, filing it away without complaint, because somewhere underneath the not knowing, she already trusted that whatever the rule was, her father was the kind of man who kept rules for good reasons. It was around that same time that he started teaching her, gently, and without ever calling it a lesson, to describe things instead of feeling them out loud. When she came home upset about a girl at the pool who had said something sharp about her hair, he did not ask how it made her feel first. He asked what the girl actually said word for word and what Willow had said back, and what happened after that, walking her through the facts the way he might have walked through an incident report, calm, specific, no embellishment. "Feelings come later," he told her once, after she had worked all the way through a hard afternoon this way. "First, we get the facts straight. Feelings are honest, but facts are what other people can actually check." She did not know it yet, but he was teaching her the same discipline that had kept his own written reports clean and undeniable for 20 years, the discipline that would matter more than either of them understood before this particular year in Fernwood Reach was finished. Willow adjusted faster than her father expected, the way children sometimes do when the adults around them are the ones still grieving. She joined the 4th grade science fair committee, made a poster about bioluminescent plankton that took 2nd place, and came home talking about a girl named Chloe who wanted to be lab partners next year. She spent whole evenings at the kitchen table gluing tiny paper illustrations of the ocean floor, while her father graded nothing, corrected nothing, and simply sat across from her doing paperwork of his own, close enough that she never once felt alone in the house. She did not notice, at first, the way some of the mothers at pickup went quiet when Amos walked up, instead of sending her home on the bus. She did not notice the welcome basket that arrived at their door in the first week, a wicker container with a candle, a bottle of sparkling cider, and a card signed by Claudette Kingsley, HOA Social Committee Chair, that read, "So glad to have some diversity in the neighborhood. We just love that." Amos read the card twice, set it on the counter, and never mentioned it to his daughter. He put the candle in a drawer and never lit it. Claudette Kingsley lived 3 houses down in the largest home on the cul-de-sac, a colonial with white columns and a landscaping budget that exceeded most people's mortgage. Her husband ran a commercial real estate firm in Suffolk. Her son, Blake, was 17, a 2nd-degree black belt, with 2 regional titles and a wall of trophies his mother photographed for the neighborhood newsletter every spring, arranging them by height before she took the picture. Claudette ran the social committee the way some people run a courtroom, and in the first month, she made a point of stopping by with a clipboard to explain, in a voice pitched for an audience that was not actually present, how things worked at Fernwood Reach. Landscaping had to match the approved plant list. Trash cans came in at dusk, not before. And of course, she added, touching Amos lightly on the forearm in a way that made him step back half a pace, "We just want everyone to feel comfortable here. All of us." He said thank you, and closed the door at a normal pace, and did not think about it again until the letters started. The first one came from Norbert Arwood, chair of the Covenants and Architectural Review Committee, a retired insurance adjuster who treated the Declaration of Covenants the way other men treated Scripture, memorized wrong and quoted with total confidence. It arrived 4 months in, a formal notice on HOA letterhead, citing a violation under what it called Section 4.2 of the community bylaws regarding unauthorized recreational equipment. Specifically, the portable basketball hoop Amos had bought Willow for her birthday and set at the edge of the driveway. Amos read the letter at his kitchen table with Willow doing homework across from him. She watched his face for a long moment, the way she had learned to since her mother died, checking for the things he never said out loud. "Are we in trouble?" she asked. "No," he said. "Somebody made a mistake, and now I get to prove it." He drove to the county clerk's office on his day off and pulled the actual recorded declaration of covenants for Fernwood Reach, filed in the Isle of Wight County Land Records, and found that the section governing recreational equipment was not 4.2 at all. It was Article 7, Section 4, and it permitted portable equipment stored against the garage between uses, which was exactly where the hoop went every evening at dusk, next to the trash cans that came in on schedule. He wrote back one page, polite, unhurried, and included a photocopy of the correct section with the relevant sentence underlined once in pencil. He did not call Arwood incompetent. He did not accuse anyone of anything. He simply corrected the record and asked, in writing, that the violation notice be withdrawn, and he kept a copy of both letters in a folder in his desk drawer, dated the same way he kept everything. If you have ever had to prove you were right using someone else's own paperwork, you already know where this is going, so go ahead and follow now so you do not miss what comes next. Arwood withdrew the notice within a week, but something about being corrected by the new resident on the cul-de-sac settled into him like a splinter, and from that point forward, every conversation between the two men carried a faint charge, the kind that comes from a man who has decided, quietly and permanently, that he does not like being right by someone else. At the next Covenants Committee meeting held in the clubhouse community room under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, Arwood raised the matter of unauthorized equipment again in general terms, without naming anyone, while looking directly across the room at nobody in particular, which everyone in the room understood to mean exactly one household. Claudette, seated beside him, nodded along and suggested the committee consider a formal equipment registration process going forward, so that we all know what belongs where. The motion passed 4-1. Doris Alder cast the 1-no vote and wrote the date in her notebook that night, along with the words 4-1 and a short list of who voted which way. It was Blake who lit the actual fire, though, and it happened on a Saturday afternoon in March, 6 weeks before the driveway confrontation the story opened with. There had been a loose dog that afternoon, a neighbor's German Shepherd mix that had slipped its collar and was working itself into a genuine panic near the mailbox cluster, snapping at anyone who approached, including 2 younger children who had frozen in place near the curb, one of them crying, both too frightened to run. Amos had been walking back from the mail with Willow when it happened. He did not run. He did not shout. He crouched low, made himself small and slow, let the dog circle him twice, watched its shoulders and not its teeth, and then simply took hold of its loose collar with a grip that did not waver even when the animal thrashed against it, walking it calmly back to its own yard while the children's mother sobbed her thanks from the porch, over and over, until Amos told her gently that it was already over and she could stop. Blake had been across the street at the time, home early from a tournament, still in his uniform jacket with his second regional title medal in a bag over his shoulder. He watched the entire thing, and something about it bothered him more than he could explain to himself that night. He was the toughest kid in Fernwood Reach. Everyone knew it. His mother made sure everyone knew it, framed the certificates, sent the newsletter photographs, and in less than a minute, a man in basketball shorts had handled a genuine crisis with a stillness that made Blake's own trophies feel, for the first time, like they might be measuring the wrong thing entirely. He mentioned it to his coach that evening, half complaining, half fishing for reassurance he did not entirely need but wanted anyway. Bruno Fletcher ran a private combative studio out of a strip mall in Smithfield, built his client list on parents who wanted their sons to look dangerous, and he did not like the sound of a teenager doubting himself 2 weeks before a regional qualifier. You want to know if you are still the guy to worry about around here? Fletcher told him, standing near the heavy bags with a towel over one shoulder. Then go find out. Ask him for a friendly spar. Controlled, supervised. If he says no, everybody sees exactly what kind of man he really is, and you never have to wonder again. Blake said he did not think Amos would go for it. That is the whole point, Fletcher said. It is not really about whether he says yes. It took 3 attempts over 3 weeks before Blake worked up the nerve to actually walk up Amos's driveway and ask. The first time, Amos was not home, and Blake stood at the end of the driveway for almost a full minute before turning around. The second time, Willow was outside chalking a hopscotch grid on the concrete, and Amos simply said, "Not in front of my daughter," and went inside without another word. The third attempt was the one that opened this story. Fletcher standing at the foot of the driveway for backup. Blake's knuckles taped like he expected the conversation to end somewhere other than a conversation. And Otis Blaine, Claudette's nephew and a rising sophomore with a growing following on social media, filming from across the street because he had learned that footage of tension in a wealthy cul-de-sac performed well online, regardless of how it started or how it ended, and regardless of what got left out of the version that eventually got posted. Deputy Carl Oswald had been called by a neighbor who saw Fletcher and Blake standing in the driveway and worried, reasonably, that things were about to turn physical. Oswald took his time getting out of the car, walked up at an unhurried pace, and by the time he reached the group, Amos had already gone inside and the moment had already dissolved into nothing more than raised voices and a phone with 11 seconds of footage. Oswald wrote nothing down that night. He told Fletcher to keep it civil, told Blake to head home, and drove off without ever knocking on the Frasers' door to hear their side of it, a pattern that would repeat itself 6 more times over the following months, and a pattern that a sheriff's internal affairs investigator would eventually find impossible to explain as coincidence. Inside the house, Willow asked her father what the boy across the street wanted. Amos told her the truth, simplified. He wanted to fight, Amos said. I told him no. Why, she asked, in the direct way 10-year-olds ask things adults have learned to dance around. He knelt down to her level the way he did every time a question actually mattered, hands resting loosely on his knees. Because there is nothing that boy could prove to me by throwing a punch, he said, and there is nothing I need to prove to him. People who need to win arguments with their fists usually already know they lost every other argument first. Willow did not fully understand it that night, but she remembered it, word for word, the way she remembered most things her father told her carefully, which mattered more than either of them realized at the time. The neighborhood did not let the matter rest. Claudette Kingsley called an unscheduled meeting of the social committee the following Tuesday, ostensibly about spring landscaping standards, and spent the first 15 minutes describing an unnamed household that was, in her words, bringing an unfortunate tension to the community that some of us worked very hard to build. Nobody said Amos's name. Nobody had to. Doris Alder sat in the back row, said nothing, and wrote 4 sentences in her notebook when she got home. Word for word as best she could recall them, with the date at the top of the page underlined twice. By Thursday, Willow came home from school in tears because she had not been included in the group text about a pool party 3 other 4th-grade girls were attending, a party hosted at the Kingsley house, and when Amos gently asked one of the other mothers about it at pickup, she looked at her shoes and said only that the invite list had gotten complicated this year. By the following week, the exclusion had followed Willow to school as well, the way these things do in a small enough town, where the same families who lived on the same cul-de-sac also sat together at pickup and signed their children up for the same after-school programs. Chloe, the girl who had wanted to be lab partners, still sat with Willow at lunch, but 2 of the other girls had started a quiet habit of walking a little faster past her locker, and one of them, repeating something she had clearly heard from a parent rather than invented on her own, told Willow that her dad was the reason there was so much drama in the neighborhood now. Willow did not fully understand the sentence, only that it was meant to hurt, and it did. He did not push her further that afternoon at pickup. He drove home with Willow crying quietly in the back seat, and that night he sat on the edge of her bed and told her the kind of thing he had learned to say without it sounding hollow. Some people decide who belongs before they even meet them, he said. That is a problem with their eyes, not with you. You are exactly the kind of person any friend would be lucky to have. She asked if it happened to him too. He said sometimes, and left it there, because there were parts of that answer that belonged to a different life entirely, one with classified briefings and deployment orders, and none of it belonged in a 10-year-old's bedroom at 8:30 on a school night. Norbert Arwood, still carrying the splinter of that first correction, found a new violation to cite within the month, this time a fence panel on the property line that he claimed exceeded the approved height by 4 inches, a measurement Amos disputed and then proved wrong with a tape measure and a photograph, mailed back in the same calm, documented style as before. The fine, $35 a day until corrected, was rescinded within the week. The letter Arwood sent in response was shorter than the first, and colder, and ended with a line that read, "Some residents seem to enjoy making this process difficult." Then, on a Tuesday morning in early April, Amos came out to find the same fence panel cracked down the center, as though something heavy had been dropped or thrown against it overnight, in a spot the security camera above the garage happened not to cover. An angle Otis Blaine, who had spent an afternoon 2 weeks earlier helping Norbert Arwood's landscaping crew and noting exactly where the camera's blind spot sat, would later be unable to explain away when someone finally asked him directly. Amos did not accuse anyone. He photographed the damage from 4 angles, noted the date and time in a plain notebook of his own, a habit that predated Fernwood Reach by 20 years and had nothing to do with the neighborhood at all, and filed a written incident report with the HOA management company rather than a verbal complaint, because verbal complaints, he had learned a long time ago, disappear the moment the person who heard them decides they are inconvenient to remember. He called the non-emergency line to have the damage on record with the county as well, and it was Deputy Carl Oswald who took the call, the same deputy who had stood in the driveway weeks earlier and written nothing down. "I need a case number to reference before I can open a new one," Oswald said. "Do you have the number from your earlier report?" "I do not believe one was ever generated," Amos said. No deputy came to the door that night. Oswald was quiet for a moment. "Property disputes between neighbors usually end up being a civil matter anyway," he said. "Might be easier on everybody if things just settled down on their own." "I would still like this call logged," Amos said, "and I would like the case number when it is generated. Whatever this becomes later, I want a record that I asked." Oswald read the address back to confirm it, gave him a case number that sounded, to Amos's ear, like it had been assigned without much thought behind it, and ended the call without asking a single question about who might have caused the damage or why. Amos thanked him, hung up the phone, and stood at his kitchen window for a long moment, watching Willow do cartwheels in the backyard, oblivious, still the girl who wanted to be a marine biologist, still the reason every letter got answered calmly, and every provocation got absorbed without so much as a raised voice. He had led men through worse than a covenants committee and a teenager with a chip on his shoulder. He had made calls that mattered more than a fence panel, in places he was not permitted to name, under conditions he would never describe to a neighbor over a hedge. But there was a particular kind of exhaustion in this, one he had not trained for, the exhaustion of being patient with people who mistook his silence for weakness, simply because he was not allowed to explain why the silence existed in the first place. That Saturday, 6 weeks after the dog in the street and 4 days before the driveway confrontation that opened this story, Bruno Fletcher showed up at a neighborhood cookout Claudette Kingsley hosted every spring, ostensibly to celebrate Blake's qualification for the Regional Combatives Championship. Strings of lights hung between the porch posts, and the smell of charcoal drifted across 3 yards, while children chased each other with sparklers someone had brought early. Fletcher had 2 drinks in him by the time Amos and Willow walked past on their way home from the community pool, and he raised his voice just enough to be heard by the small crowd gathered near the grill. "There he goes," Fletcher said, loud enough to carry. "Big, tough Navy man, too good to let a kid test his skills. Some men only look strong until somebody actually asks them to prove it." A few people near the grill laughed, uncertain. The kind of laugh that comes from not wanting to be the only one who does not. Doris Alder, standing near the drink table with a paper cup of lemonade, did not laugh. She watched Amos's face carefully, the same way she used to watch witnesses on the stand, and she noted later that he did not so much as slow his pace. Amos kept walking, one hand resting lightly on Willow's shoulder, and said nothing at all, though several of the mothers standing near the grill would later tell an investigator that they saw something shift in his face for exactly 1 second. Not anger, something closer to a decision being made and immediately set aside for later use. Willow looked up at her father as they walked. Why does that man keep saying stuff like that? She asked. Because he thinks getting a reaction out of me will prove something about who I am, Amos said. It will not. It will only prove something about him. She thought about that the rest of the walk home, the way she thought about most things her father told her. Carefully, like she was filing it away somewhere permanent. The same drawer in her mind where she kept the thing he told her about people deciding who belongs before they even meet them. The Monday before all of that, though, Willow had her real science fair, the one that counted toward the district competition. And for one whole evening, none of it, not Arwood, not Claudette, not the cracked fence panel, mattered at all. She stood beside a trifold poster covered in hand-drawn illustrations of anglerfish and described bioluminescence to a rotating audience of parents with a seriousness that made two judges laugh with delight rather than at her. Amos stood at the back of the gymnasium in a collared shirt he rarely wore, arms crossed, watching his daughter explain photophores to a woman holding a clipboard, and for those 2 hours he was not a senior chief keeping his mouth shut about an assignment he could not name, and he was not a widower managing a house alone, and he was not a target of anybody's fine or anybody's whispered committee meeting. He was only a father, and when Willow spotted him across the room and lifted her second-place ribbon over her head like a trophy belt, he laughed out loud for the first time in weeks. A sound Doris Alder, standing nearby with her own granddaughter's project 2 tables down, noted with something warmer than her usual pencil marks. That night she wrote only one line in the notebook, no date required. Good father, whatever else people around here want to say. That memory was still sitting warm in his chest 4 days later, when Fletcher and Blake walked up the driveway one more time, and this time it did not stay quiet for long. You going to keep hiding behind that little girl forever, Fletcher said, once Amos had set the grocery bags down, because from where I am standing, that looks a lot like a man who knows exactly what would happen if he said yes. Blake shifted, uncomfortable in a way his coach did not seem to notice, tape already loosening at the edge of one knuckle. I just want one round, he said. Controlled. Rules. Nothing crazy. I want to know where I actually stand. Amos looked at him directly for the first time since the conversation started, and something in his voice changed. Not louder, just heavier. The way a door sounds different when it is about to be shut for good. You already know where you stand, son, he said. You are standing in front of a man who has no interest in teaching a 17-year-old a lesson with his hands, because there is nothing about that lesson that would help either one of us. If you want to test yourself, get in the ring at your qualifier next month. That is what it is there for. This is different, Blake said, and for a moment something almost like doubt crossed his face, quickly buried under the posture his coach had spent 2 years drilling into him. It is not different, Amos said. It is smaller, and I am not interested in small. Fletcher laughed, short and sharp, the sound of a man who had expected a different ending and did not know yet how to write around this one. Real tough talk for a guy who will not put his hands up, he said, loud enough that a woman 2 houses down glanced out from behind her curtain, loud enough that Otis Blaine, phone already raised across the street, caught every word of it clean. Amos bent down, picked the grocery bags back up off the concrete without hurry, and looked at both of them one last time. We are done here, he said, and walked toward his front door. Behind the front window, Willow had come to stand at the glass without either man noticing, watching her father's back as he crossed the driveway, watching the way his shoulders stayed level the entire way, the way they had stayed level the day he pulled a stranger's dog off a frightened child, the way they had stayed level every single time somebody in this neighborhood had decided he needed to be tested. Before we get to what happens next, hit subscribe, because the next part of this story is the part that changes everything for every single person standing in that driveway. What none of them knew, not Fletcher with his whistle, not Blake with his taped knuckles, not Claudette watching from her kitchen window with a phone of her own already in her hand, was that a command duty officer at Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek had logged a call that same evening, careful and procedural, asking whether Senior Chief Amos Fraser's residential address had generated any law enforcement contacts in the past 90 days. The question was routine, the kind asked quietly about personnel whose files carried certain flags, and the answer that came back, 7 contacts, 0 reports written, would set something in motion within his command that nobody standing in that quiet, sunlit cul-de-sac could yet imagine, something that would eventually reach far beyond a cracked fence panel and a mother's clipboard and a coach who mistook silence for weakness. all the way to a public hearing where a letter would finally be read aloud that none of them were prepared to hear. And behind the blinds of the house across the street, the 11 seconds Otis Blaine had already saved sat quietly in a folder on his phone, and inside that same folder, 41 seconds of what had actually happened in that driveway were about to go missing, deliberately, carefully, in a way that would take months to undo. Fletcher did not let it end there. As Amos turned toward his front door with the grocery bags back in his hands, Fletcher stepped forward and closed a hand around his forearm, hard enough to leave a mark, hard enough that two neighbors watching from their porches would later swear, independently, that they heard the grip land before they heard anything else. "Do not walk away from me," Fletcher said. What happened over the next 4 seconds took longer to explain in every report that followed than it took to actually happen. Amos set the bags down without looking at them. He turned into the grip rather than away from it, took hold of Fletcher's wrist with one hand and his elbow with the other, and put him on one knee on the concrete with a control so precise that Fletcher's own shoulder never came close to tearing, though from a distance, with no sound and no context, it looked like exactly the kind of violence the moment had been building toward for 6 weeks. Amos held him there for perhaps 2 seconds, said something low that only Fletcher heard, and let go. He stood, picked the bags back up, and walked into his house without another word. Behind the front window, Willow had watched the whole thing with both hands pressed flat against the glass, and when her father came inside, calm, unhurried, setting the milk in the refrigerator like nothing at all had happened, she asked him only one question. "Are you hurt?" "No, baby," he said. "Are you?" She shook her head, though her hands were still shaking slightly at her sides, and he pulled out a kitchen chair and sat with her until the shaking stopped, the same patience he had used for every hard question she had ever asked him. Blake had not moved the entire time Fletcher was on the ground, and it was the stillness on the boy's face, not the fall, that Doris Alder would later describe as the moment she finally understood something real had shifted, not just in that driveway, but in the boy standing beside it. By that night, Otis Blaine had already trimmed the footage from his phone down to 19 seconds, cutting out the moment Fletcher's hand closed on Amos's arm, and posted it with a caption that needed no embellishment to do its damage. "Man attacks teenager's coach in quiet family neighborhood." The clip reached 40,000 views before midnight and 1,100 more by the time the sun came up, and by the following afternoon a reporter from a local television station had already called the Fernwood Reach management office asking for comment. If you have ever watched the truth get edited down to fit somebody else's story, stay with me, because this is exactly where that story starts to come apart. Claudette Kingsley used the moment the way she used every moment, calling an emergency session of the board rather than the social committee this time, and Norbert Arwood arrived with a folder already prepared, recommending the Frasers' HOA privileges be suspended pending review, a suggestion that had no basis anywhere in the actual declaration of covenants, and that the board's own attorney, present only by phone, quietly declined to endorse. Doris Alder did something that week she had never once done in 30 years of watching testimony from behind a court reporter's machine. She decided to become a witness herself. She drove to the Isle of Wight County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak with someone in professional standards, and she brought with her a spiral notebook filled with 11 months of dated entries, the group text summary, the 4-to-1 committee vote, the line about the fence, and the exact words Fletcher had used at the cookout, because she had written every one of them down the same night she heard them. Around the same time, a records request filed through the county attorney's office on Amos's behalf and paid for out of his own savings because he refused to let Willow's name attached to a lawyer's letterhead without one, pulled the original file from Otis Blaine's cloud backup rather than the version he had posted. The metadata told a story the caption never did. The original recording ran 1 minute and 40 seconds. The posted version ran 59 seconds. 41 seconds, including the full 3 seconds of Fletcher's hand closing on Amos's arm, had been cut cleanly from the middle, a fact an outside technician was able to confirm, because the file's internal timestamp had never been altered, only the visible portion trimmed around it. A separate email thread produced later through the community management company at the request of a fair housing intake worker named Sabira Arden showed something else entirely, a chain among board members discussing, in careful language, whether the household in question was, quote, the right fit for what we are trying to build here. Sent from an account whose name the management company's own server logs listed only as a shared administrative address, never conclusively tied to one individual. A gap that would remain in the record long after everything else about that spring had been settled. Sabira Arden called Amos directly once her office opened a formal inquiry under the Fair Housing Act. "Mr. Fraser," she said, and something in the careful weight she put on his name made him pause for half a second longer than the sentence required. "I want you to know this office takes what has happened at Fernwood Reach seriously, and I want to walk you through exactly what happens next." He thanked her, and did not ask why she had said his name that way. He had a guess. He did not yet know he was right. Word of an outside investigation moves through a small community faster than the community itself ever intends, and by the time the county's Property Owners Association Ombudsman Office confirmed a formal complaint had been filed under Virginia Code Section 55.1, 1819, the board had already scheduled an open session, required under that same statute whenever a resident formally disputes an association's enforcement action, and Claudette Kingsley, who had never once in 11 months called Amos anything but a household or a situation, found herself required by law to let him speak first. He stood at the podium in the same clubhouse community room where the fence panel vote had once passed 4-1, Willow seated in the second row beside Doris, and he did not raise his voice, because he had never needed to. "I have a written statement, and I have 3 documents," he said. "I am also going to read something else into this record tonight, something I would not have brought here if the last 11 months had gone differently." He read the metadata report first, the one showing 41 missing seconds. He read 3 lines from the email chain Sabira Arden's office had produced, the household in question, the right fit, sent from an address the company's own records could not attach to a single name. He read the dates from Doris Alder's notebook aloud, one after another, until the room understood exactly how long this had been building, and exactly how many people had known and said nothing. Then he opened a plain envelope he had carried in his jacket pocket, and read a short letter from Lieutenant Commander Ronan Foster, his commanding officer at Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek, verifying only what the Navy permitted anyone to verify about a man in Amos's line of work. It confirmed his rank, his active duty status, his honorable service record, and it stated plainly that his current operational assignment was classified under federal law and would not be disclosed to any civilian body for any reason, including this one. "That is the most I am permitted to tell you about what I do," Amos said, folding the letter closed. "What I can tell you is what I did not do. I did not start what happened in my driveway. I did not damage a fence I built myself. I did not send an email about whether my daughter's family was the right fit for this neighborhood. Somebody in this room did all 3, and I would like to know who, the same way you would." Norbert Arwood half rose from his seat near the front row, folder still clutched against his chest. "This is not the appropriate venue for personnel records," he said, his voice thinner than it usually sounded at these meetings. "I did not bring a personnel record," Amos said. "I brought exactly 4 sentences a lawyer for the Navy said I was allowed to bring, and 3 documents produced by this county, not by me. If that makes anyone in this room uncomfortable, I would ask them to consider why." Nobody answered him. Claudette Kingsley, seated at the board table with her clipboard finally still in front of her, looked at the folder in Arwood's hands and then away from it, and said nothing at all. If a room full of people finally hearing the whole truth is the moment you have been waiting for, hit subscribe now, because what happens next did not stay contained to one clubhouse meeting. The room did not erupt the way rooms sometimes do in stories. It went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when several people realize at the same time that they are each individually afraid of what comes next. Norbert Arwood asked to be excused before the session even closed. Claudette Kingsley said nothing at all, and it was that silence, more than anything Amos had read aloud, that several residents mentioned afterward as the detail they would remember longest. What followed over the next several months was not the clean, single night of reckoning the room might have wanted. It rarely is. Bruno Fletcher was charged under Virginia Code Section 18.257, assault and battery, and the case moved through the Isle of Wight County General District Court the way most such cases do. An arraignment within 72 hours. A plea agreement worked out 4 months later rather than a trial. A conviction on a reduced misdemeanor count, a suspended sentence, and a permanent note in his file that ended his combative studio's insurance coverage within the year. At the single pretrial hearing Amos attended, Fletcher's attorney objected twice to the metadata report being described as conclusive, both times on the grounds of foundation, and both times the judge simply asked the prosecution to lay a proper foundation before continuing. A small procedural exchange that took less than a minute and settled the matter entirely. Otis Blaine was referred to the Commonwealth's attorney for review under the state's false reporting statute, but the office declined to prosecute, citing the difficulty of proving intent to deceive rather than ordinary carelessness in editing, a decision Sabira Arden's report called disappointing but not surprising. Norbert R. Wood resigned from the Covenants Committee the week after the open session, citing personal reasons, and kept his house on the cul-de-sac, though he stopped attending community events entirely. Claudette Kingsley was removed from her position as Social Committee Chair by a board vote of 4-3, a margin close enough that Doris Alder noted it in her book with a single word beneath the date. Finally, Deputy Carl Oswald was placed on administrative leave for 6 weeks, while the Sheriff's Internal Affairs Division reviewed 7 separate calls to the Fraser address over 11 months, none of which had generated a written report. The investigation, led by Sergeant Iris Bradley, concluded with a finding of sustained in part, and Oswald returned to duty afterward with a formal written reprimand in his file and a reassignment to a different patrol zone, a resolution that satisfied almost no one completely, which was, Sabira Arden told Amos privately, usually the most honest sign that a process had actually been followed rather than performed. The Fair Housing Act claim itself, filed under Title 42, Section 3617, moved slower than any of it, working through HUD's intake process for the better part of a year before Fernwood Reaches Homeowners Association agreed to a settlement that included no admission of wrongdoing, a new non-discrimination policy for enforcement actions, mandatory training for the Covenants Committee, and a monetary sum that a lawyer for the association described, carefully, as reflecting the cost of resolving the matter rather than any finding of fault. The policy was announced at the very next open meeting. Whether the county's overworked management company would ever actually fund the training it required remained, 8 months later, an open question nobody on either side seemed eager to answer out loud. The 19-second clip did not disappear once the truth came out, the way Amos had quietly hoped it might. It stayed online for months, reposted and argued over long after the county's own investigation had moved past it, and Willow found out about it not from her father but from a classmate who pulled it up on a tablet at lunch, asking her, without any particular unkindness, if that was really her dad. She came home that afternoon and asked him directly, the way he had taught her to ask things, stating the facts first. "People are watching a video where you push a man down," she said. "They think you did something wrong." He sat with her at the kitchen table and told her, plainly, what the video left out, the same 41 seconds he had once described to a room full of strangers. "Sometimes the truth takes longer to travel than the wrong version of it," he said. "That does not mean the wrong version wins. It just means you have to be patient enough to let the whole story catch up." She thought about that for a long moment, the same careful way she thought about most things he told her, and then asked if she could bring her own printed copy of the metadata report to school, in case anyone brought it up again. He almost smiled. "That is exactly the kind of thing I would do," he told her, and let her keep a copy in her backpack, though she never once had to use it. Blake Kingsley did not attend that final open session, but he came to the Fraser house alone 3 weeks afterward, without his coach, without his mother, and stood on the porch for a long moment before Amos opened the door. "Did not know about the missing part of the video," Blake said. "I want you to know that, and I should never have asked you in the first place. Not the first time, not the third time. My coach kept telling me it would prove something. It did not prove anything except that I was not thinking for myself." Amos studied him for a moment, the same stillness Doris had once described settling over his face, though this time it looked closer to something patient than something guarded. "It takes more than most grown men I know to say that out loud," Amos said. "Go finish your qualifier. Win it because you worked for it, not because you needed anybody to be afraid of you first." "I already withdrew from Fletcher's program," Blake said. "Found a new coach in Suffolk. She actually makes us run drills on why we fight, not just how." "That sounds like a better program," Amos said, and meant it. Blake nodded and left, and did not come back to ask for anything again. If a story like this is exactly the kind you want more of, subscribing means you never miss the next one. By early autumn, Willow was back in the pool party group text. invited this time by Chloe's mother directly rather than through Claudette's old committee, and she brought home a bioluminescence project the following spring that took first place at the district level rather than second, a ribbon she pinned next to the old one instead of replacing it. She stood a little taller at pickup now, and when a younger girl once asked her, in the blunt way children ask things, whether it was true her dad had beaten someone up, Willow answered the way her father had taught her, calmly, with the facts in order, and watched the girl's face change once she actually heard the whole story instead of the 19-second version of it. Doris Alder kept her notebook, out of habit more than necessity now, though she still wrote the date every time something worth remembering happened on the street. She had told Sergeant Iris Bradley, near the end of her interview at the sheriff's office, that she almost regretted not coming forward sooner. Bradley had shaken her head at that. "You came forward the moment it mattered," she said. "Most people never come forward at all." Doris wrote that down too when she got home, though she left off the date, because some sentences, she decided, were worth keeping regardless of when they were said. Amos still ran at 6 in the morning, still coiled the garden hose the same way every evening, still told neighbors when they asked that he was in the Navy, and nothing more, because that much had never actually changed and never would. The settlement money from the fair housing claim went, most of it, into a modest trust for Willow's education, and a smaller portion into replacing the cracked fence panel with one built solid enough that nobody would ever again find a blind spot behind it. Two things, though, stayed open long after the settlement checks cleared and the new policy hung framed in the clubhouse lobby. The management company's server logs never did identify which board member had actually typed the words "the right fit for what we are trying to build here," and the account remained, in every official record, an unattributed shared address, a gap nobody with the authority to close it seemed particularly motivated to chase down once the larger case had resolved. And 10 minutes of footage from a second camera across the street, one that should have covered the exact angle Otis Blaine's phone had missed, was never recovered at all, reported by its owner as accidentally overwritten the same week investigators first came asking questions. A coincidence that Sergeant Bradley's final report noted, dryly, without ever quite calling it anything else. On a quiet evening in late October, Amos stood at his kitchen window again, watching Willow do cartwheels in the backyard the same way she had the spring before, and his phone buzzed once with a message from a number he did not recognize. No name attached, only 3 words. "We are watching." He looked at it for a long moment, said nothing to his daughter, and set the phone face down on the counter, the same way he had once set an unread card from a wicker basket down, and never mentioned it again, because some things, he had learned a long time ago, were worth carrying quietly, and some things were only worth carrying until you knew exactly who needed to carry them instead.